I have washed something like 9,000 dinner plates inside that school. 9,000, maybe more. In all those years, I was never once afraid inside its walls. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in the middle of March, a woman with a queen's name came to take a child away. And a boy in a red coat stood in a doorway and would not move. I want to tell you about that boy. But first I have to tell you about the door and the rain and the smell of boiled parsnips, because that is how it happened. Things like this don't arrive with trumpets. They arrive while you are peeling parsnips. My name is Nettie Crow. I am 63 years old and I have been the kitchen woman at St. Aldwyn's Day School in Harrogate since I was 29. That is not a grand job. Nobody writes it in a book. I make soup for 140 children, and I know which ones don't eat their crusts, and I know which ones come to school hungry and pretend they're not. Harrogate is the capital of Renholt. If you have never been, it is a cold city that thinks well of itself. Gray stone, gray sky, a river the color of dishwater that everyone insists is beautiful. Up on the hill sits Thornmere Palace, all towers and flags, and down in the low street sits our school, 300 years old, with a leaking roof and a stone arch over the front walk that the children call the Scholars' Gate. And under that arch, every school day, stood a household guard. That is the strange part, and I should explain it, or none of the rest will make sense. 12 years ago the old king, Aldrich, God rest him, decided that the royal children would not be taught behind palace walls. He said a child raised in a garden grows soft. He said a prince who has never queued for his bread will never understand a country that queues for everything. Half the court thought he'd gone mad. The newspapers had a lovely time with it. But he did it. He sent his own boy to a school in the ward. And when Aldrich died and his son took the throne, the son kept the promise because he had liked it. Which is how, in the autumn before all this, a 9-year-old girl called Princess Elara came to sit in a classroom on the second floor of St. Aldwyn's, third desk from the window, and eat my soup. She was a small thing, brown hair that never stayed where anyone put it. She had a habit of holding her spoon wrong, gripping it in her fist like a shovel, and one of the other kitchen women wanted to correct her, and I said, "Leave the child alone, she's 9. She liked the parsnip soup. Nobody likes the parsnip soup. She'd come through the line and say, "Is it the orange one today, Mrs. Crow?" And I'd say it was, and she'd look so pleased you'd think I'd handed her a pony. That's all, that's who she was to me, a girl who liked the orange soup. The guard under the arch was a young man named Ivan Marsh, Corporal, 2nd Company, Household Guard of Renholt. I want to be careful here, because since all this happened, people have written about him as if he were a statue that learned to breathe. He wasn't. He was 24. He had a chipped front tooth. He got hay fever every May and stood there with his eyes streaming and refused to sniff. He came to us in September. Before him, there'd been a heavy-set sergeant who used to slip the children boiled sweets when the headmaster wasn't looking, and everybody adored him, and when they moved him on the children were furious. So Marsh arrived into a school of 140 small enemies. He stood under that arch 6 hours a day, bearskin cap, scarlet tunic, rifle at his shoulder, boots that he polished so hard you could check your teeth in them. He did not smile. He did not speak. He did not look down when the boys marched past him doing silly walks. For 3 weeks straight, a child named Tobias Vane stood 2 feet in front of him every single lunch break and made faces at him, and Marsh looked over the top of his head at the far end of the street like Tobias had never been born. I brought him tea once in October when the rain came sideways for a whole week. I set it on the wall beside him. He didn't move, didn't look, didn't thank me. I said, "Suit yourself," and went back inside, and I was cross about it for a full day. Then the following Monday I came out at 6 in the morning to take the milk in, and the mug was on my step, washed, rinsed clean, dried, set upside down the way I do it. He never mentioned it, not once ever, but every mug I ever left on that wall came back washed. That was Ivan Marsh. Now the Tuesday. It had rained all night and it was still spitting in the morning. That fine gray Harrogate rain that doesn't fall so much as hang there and wait for you to walk into it. The gutters on Cobb Street were running brown. The whole city smelled of wet stone and coal smoke. I got in at 5. That's normal. Soup takes hours if you do it properly, and I do it properly. Parsnips that day. Parsnips and barley and a ham bone. I remember because the ham bone was a good one, and I remember thinking Elara would be pleased. By 8:30 the children were coming through the arch in their coats, shrieking, kicking puddles, being scolded. Marsh was already at his post. He'd been there since 8. His cap was beaded with rain and he hadn't wiped it. The princess arrived at 8:20 in the plain black school carriage, not a royal one. That was the whole point of the thing, with one lady-in-waiting and a driver. She jumped down into a puddle on purpose. The lady-in-waiting said something sharp. Elara went inside. She passed Marsh. She didn't look at him, he didn't look at her. I saw all this because the kitchen window faces the front walk, and I was standing at it with my hands in a sink of cold water, watching, the way I have watched 34 years of children arrive at school. That was the last ordinary minute of that day. At around 10, a boy came down to the kitchen with a message from the headmaster asking whether we could stretch lunch to a few extra portions. Visitors, he said. I didn't think anything of it. We had visitors constantly. School inspectors, charity women, men from the ministry who wanted to be photographed near the princess and then leave. I said we could stretch it, and I put more barley in. At 11:30, I went up the back stairs to the pantry on the first landing, and through the window on the half landing, I saw the yard behind the school. There were 2 men standing in it. I want to describe this properly, because this is the moment the day turned, and I didn't know it yet. They were standing near the coal store where nobody stands, both in dark coats, long ones, good cloth. One was smoking. The other had his hands behind his back and was looking up at the windows, counting them, it seemed to me, moving his eyes along the row. Now, men in good coats in a schoolyard is not a crime. But here is the thing I noticed, and I noticed it before I understood it, the way you sometimes taste that milk has turned before your brain says sour. Their boots were wrong. Palace men, real ones, guards, footmen, the king's people, they polish. It's not vanity, it's the whole religion of the place. Marsh's boots had a shine on them like a black river. These 2 had good coats and cheap boots, mud to the ankle, and one had his laces done in a knot instead of a bow. Rich coat, poor boots. It sat wrong in my chest. I stood at that window with a bag of barley in my arms for longer than I should have. Then the one who was counting windows stopped counting and looked directly at the half landing and looked directly at me. And he smiled. I went to the pantry. I put the barley down. My hands weren't steady, and I told myself it was because I'm 63 and I'd carried it up 2 flights. At 12:15, the children came down to lunch. The long hall, the benches, the noise, 140 children make a sound like the sea. Elara came through the line and I said, "Orange one today," and she grinned and held her bowl up with both hands. I remember she had ink on her cheek, right here on the left side. She'd been writing and leaned her face on her hand. I nearly wiped it off with my apron. I nearly did. I've thought about that more times than I can count. Instead I said, "Off you go," and she went and sat down. At 20:01, the carriages came. You could hear them before you could see them. Not the sound of a carriage, the sound of the street stopping. Cobb Street is a working street. Barrows, hawkers, the fishman, the woman who sells hot chestnuts by the postbox. All of it went quiet, and then all of it started up again in a different key. A low, fast murmur, everybody talking at once, nobody talking loud. I dried my hands and went to the kitchen window. 3 carriages. The first 2 were plain, dark, unmarked. The third was not. The third had the Renholt arms on the door, the tower, and the two hares, and 4 horses, and a driver in palace livery. And the crowd came. That's Harrogate. 30 seconds and there were 40 people on the pavement, and half of them had their hats off, and a woman was standing on the milk crate outside the grocer's to see better. Marsh had not moved. He was still under the arch. His rifle was still at his shoulder. But I saw his eyes go to the third carriage and stay there for perhaps 2 seconds longer than a guard's eyes should stay anywhere. And then he came to attention properly, the full thing, the crash of the heels that you feel in the paving stones. The door of the third carriage opened, and Queen Adelheid stepped down into the rain. I had never seen her in life. Only in the papers, and in the papers she was always at some distance, in a hat, being gracious at a hospital. She was smaller than I expected. That's what struck me first. In the pictures she looked tall, and it was the hats doing it. She was the king's second wife, Elara's stepmother. There were stories about that, of course, because there are always stories, and I never listened to them because I have never once found gossip to be worth the time it takes. She came up the walk fast, not gracious, not slow. Her skirts were dragging in the wet and she didn't seem to care, and she was pale in a way I remember very clearly, not powdered pale, but that gray-white you see on a woman who hasn't slept and hasn't eaten. And behind her came the 2 men from the yard. The coats, the boots. They had come around the building and they fell in behind her, and they walked with their heads slightly turned outward, watching the crowd, watching the windows, and the one with the knotted laces had his hand inside his coat and kept it there. Now, understand what I felt. It wasn't heroism. It was the flat, sick drop of a woman who has just understood that the 2 men she saw counting windows are walking behind the Queen of Renholt as if they belong there. I ran. 63 years old, wet apron. I ran out of the kitchen and down the corridor toward the front hall. By the time I got there, the Queen was already inside. The headmaster, Mr. Ballard, was a decent, useless man who had spent his life avoiding decisions. He had come out of his study without his jacket, and he was bowing and stammering and going a color I didn't like. The Queen said, and I heard this from 12 feet away, standing behind a coat rack like a fool, she said, "Bring me the princess. Now she is leaving with me." Ballard said something about the council, and about the king's instruction that the princess complete the term, and about forgive him procedure. And she cut across him. She said, "There is a threat to her life. Do you understand me today? Get the child." The whole hall heard it, 2 teachers on the stairs, a boy carrying a stack of hymn books who stopped dead, me behind the coat rack. And I watched Mr. Ballard's face do the thing that decent, useless men's faces do, which is to hand the entire weight of the moment to somebody else. He turned to the nearest teacher and said, "Fetch her." The teacher went, and the 2 men in the good coats came inside, out of the rain, and stood one on either side of the front door. Not behind the Queen, not beside her. On either side of the door. That's when I knew. I'm not clever, I'm not brave, but I have stood in one building for 34 years, and I know what it means when 2 men who don't work here position themselves at the only exit. They brought Elara down. She came down the main stairs with the teacher's hand on her shoulder, and she still had ink on her cheek, and she still had her napkin tucked into her collar because nobody had told her to take it out. 9 years old, confused, not frightened. She looked at all the adults standing about in the hall, and she must have thought she was in trouble for something. Then she saw the Queen, and she stopped on the 3rd step. I have thought about that stop for 2 years now. She wasn't afraid of her stepmother. I don't believe she was. But she stopped, and she looked at the 2 men by the door, and she looked back at the Queen, and something in that little face closed like a shutter. The Queen said, "Elara, come, we're going home." And Elara said very quietly, "Is father there?" The Queen didn't answer. She just held out her hand. And the child came down the last 3 steps and took it, because she was 9, and because that is what 9-year-olds do. They came out of the front door and onto the walk into the rain, and the crowd on Cobb Street made a noise, not a cheer, a kind of soft "oh," and every hat came off. I was in the doorway behind them. I had no business being there. Nobody stopped me. The walk from that door to the street is about 40 feet, straight, paved, with the Scholars' Gate in the middle of it. That stone arch, 300 years old, worn smooth in the middle where 100 generations of children have run their hands along it. Corporal Ivan Marsh was standing under it. He had turned. That was the first thing I registered, and it made no sense to me. All morning he had faced the street. Now he was facing the school, facing us, facing them. And he had brought his rifle down off his shoulder. Not aimed, nothing like that. He'd brought it down in a cross held at the port, the way they do, both hands on it, diagonal across the chest. His face was exactly what it always was, nothing in it, rain on the peak of his cap. The Queen came up the walk with the child's hand in hers and the 2 men a step behind, and she did not slow down, because in her whole life nothing had ever required her to slow down. She was 3 feet from him when he spoke. He said, "Your Majesty." And she stopped. I want to try to give you the sound of it, because the sound is the thing I still hear. The rain on the arch, the gutter running, 40 people on the pavement absolutely silent. Somewhere behind us in the school, faintly, 100 children in the dining hall, still eating, still shrieking, who knew nothing at all. And a 24-year-old man saying, very clearly and without any expression whatsoever, "Your Majesty, I can't let the princess pass." Nobody breathed. The Queen looked at him. I don't think she had properly seen him until that second. He'd been furniture, a red coat under an arch part of the building. She said, "I beg your pardon. The princess is in my charge between 8 and 4. Standing order signed by His Majesty. She leaves this ground with the council's writ and the palace seal, ma'am, or she leaves at 4 o'clock with her carriage." He said it the way you'd read out a shipping notice. The Queen's voice went up, "I am her mother." And Marsh said, "And God forgive me, I have never in my life heard anything said so gently and so immovably at the same time. No, ma'am, you are the Queen, and the order doesn't have an exception for you." One of the men in the good coats stepped forward. He came around the Queen's left shoulder and he said something low, and I only caught the end of it. "Out of the way, soldier." And Marsh did not look at him. Not once. Not for a fraction of a second. He kept his eyes on a point somewhere above the Queen's head, on the wet gray street, on nothing at all, the exact way he had looked over Tobias Vane's head every lunchtime for 3 weeks. But he said, still in that flat reading-out voice, "Sir, step back behind Her Majesty." The man didn't. And Marsh said, "Sir, I'm going to ask once more, and then I'm going to ask the Queen who you are and where your badge is." I saw it. From 9 feet away, in the doorway with a wet apron on, I saw the man's hand go still inside his coat. And I saw the Queen turn her head and look at him. Look at him properly, for the first time, the way you look at a man you have known for 6 days and trusted with your terror. And I watched Queen Adelheid of Renholt, a woman who had come here white-faced and frantic to save a child she was afraid was going to die, look down at that man's boots. Cheap boots, mud to the ankle, one lace tied in a knot instead of a bow. The rain came down. Elara's small hand was still inside hers. And the Queen said, in a voice I will hear until I am buried, "Where did you say you were from? Where did you say you were from?" The man with the knotted laces didn't answer her. That was the answer. I have gone over the next 11 seconds more times than I have gone over anything in my life. 11 seconds. I know, because 2 years later at the inquiry, a clerk read the timings out loud and I sat in the back of that room and thought, that's all it was. It felt like a season. The man moved, not toward the Queen. That's the thing people always get wrong when they tell it in the taverns. They say he lunged at the queen because that makes a better song. He didn't. He went for the child. He came around Adelhaide's left side, low and fast, and his hand came out of his coat and there was a short blade in it, no longer than a bread knife, and he wasn't reaching for the queen at all. He was reaching past her down for Elara's arm. He never touched her, because Corporal Ivan Marsh was already there. I don't know how. I've asked soldiers. They shrug and say training, as if that explains a man crossing 4 feet of wet paving before another man has finished deciding to move. But he was there. He came off that arch like the arch had thrown him. He didn't shoot. I want that written down, and I want it written down first, because in the weeks afterward some very stupid men in some very warm rooms suggested that he ought to have. He had a loaded rifle. Behind him, 40 feet away, were 140 children in a dining hall, and a stone corridor that would have carried the sound of a shot into every one of their ears for the rest of their lives. In front of him, on Cobb Street, were 40 townspeople standing in the rain with their hats in their hands, and a woman on a milk crate, and the chestnut seller, and a baby in a shawl. He did not fire his weapon. He turned it sideways. He came in between the man and the child, and he put the length of that rifle across his own body like a gate, and he took the whole weight of a running man on it, and he held. The queen was knocked back 3 steps. She kept hold of Elara. To her everlasting credit, and I will say this to anyone in Renholt who wants to argue about that woman, she took the child down with her, under her, and she covered her. And the second man, the one who had been smoking, ran. There was a sound then that I had never heard before and have never heard since. 40 people breathing in at once. Then the whole street came off the pavement. I don't want to make Harrogate into something noble. Harrogate is a city that will steal your washing off the line. But the fishman, Dahlan, who is 60 and has one good eye, went after that running man with a filleting knife in his fist and a face like the Last Judgment. And the chestnut woman put her brazier over coals across the wet cobbles, hissing, and got hold of his coat. And a boy of about 15 who I'd never seen before or since brought him down with a barrow. They caught him outside the grocer's. He didn't get 11 feet. And I want you to know that the crowd would have killed him. I saw it. That is not a figure of speech. 40 ordinary people who had come out into the rain to see a queen were, for about 4 seconds, ready to beat a man to death on the cobbles outside a school, and they would have done it, and they'd have gone home to their tea afterward. What stopped them was a voice. Marsh's voice from under the arch, not shouting. Leave him standing. He's the only one who knows who sent them. And 40 people stopped. Now let me come back to the arch, because that is where I was, 9 feet away, with my hands full of nothing. The first man was still on his feet. He and Marsh were locked up against the stone, and the blade was in there somewhere between them, and Marsh had one hand on the rifle and the other clamped on the man's wrist, and he was walking him backward into the pillar the way you'd walk a barrel up a ramp. Steady, almost patient. He got him against the stone. He got the wrist against the stone. He knocked the man's hand against 300 years of granite until the blade came out of it and rang on the paving. And then Ivan Marsh, 24 years old, put his forearm across that man's chest and pinned him there, and turned his head, not to the crowd, not to the queen. He turned his head to look for the child. He found her. She was on the ground under the queen's arms, wide-eyed, ink still on her cheek. And I watched his shoulders come down about half an inch. Then he said, still in that same flat voice, he used to read out standing orders. Ma'am, are you injured? And Queen Adelheid, lying in the wet on a school path in a ruined dress with a 9-year-old under her, said, No. Is the princess injured? No. Then would you kindly take her back inside the building, ma'am, both of you. Now, please. She went. The Queen of Renholt picked up her stepdaughter and carried her back through her own school's front door, because a corporal of the household guard told her to, and she never once looked back, and I stepped out of the way to let her by, and she looked at me, and I have never seen a human face carry so much shame. Here's what nobody in the street knew yet. 3 days earlier, a letter had come to Thornmere Palace. The king was north at Velen opening a bridge 6 days' ride. The letter said a man had been paid to take the princess from the school. It named a day. It named the hour. It was not signed. And the men who brought that letter to the queen, who read it to her, who told her the palace guard could not be trusted because the plot had a hand inside the palace, who told her the council writ would take 4 days and she had 2, those men were the men in the good coats. They were the plot. They didn't need to storm a school. They needed a frightened woman to walk a child out through the front door and into an unmarked carriage. She very nearly did it. She very nearly did it out of love, which is the cruelty of the whole thing, and which is why I have never let anyone in my hearing call Adelheid a wicked stepmother. She was a woman with no husband in the house, a threat in her hand, and 6 days of not sleeping. And what stood between that child and a carriage on Cobb Street was not the council, and not the ministry, and not the palace, and not the king. It was a boy with hay fever, who had read his standing orders and believed them. He was bleeding. Nobody noticed for a long time, and by nobody I mean me, and I have not entirely forgiven myself. The blade had gone into his left side, up under the ribs in the middle of all that scarlet cloth. Scarlet on scarlet. You couldn't see it. That is the oldest joke in the world about those coats, and I have never been able to laugh at it since. He stood there holding that man against the pillar for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because Dahlan the fishman kept saying it afterward over and over in the pub until people crossed the road to avoid him. 11 minutes. 11 bloody minutes. Constables came, then 2 riders from the ward barracks, then at last palace men, real ones, boots like black rivers. An officer arrived and started giving orders, and Marsh said, "Sir, I'm not released from this post." The officer, to his credit, understood at once. He said, "Corporal, you are relieved." And Marsh said, "Thank you, sir," and let go of the man and stepped back under the arch and came to attention. And stayed there. It was Elara who saw it. She'd got away from the teachers upstairs, the way children do, and she came out of the front door in her stockinged feet, and she came down that walk in the rain, and everybody was too busy to stop her. She stopped in front of him and looked up. He looked straight over her head, as he always had. And she said, "I heard it, I was 6 feet away," she said. "Your coat's wet on one side." He didn't answer. She said, "It's not rain." And she reached up and put 2 fingers on the wet part and looked at them and looked at him, and her whole face came apart. And Corporal Ivan Marsh, who had not spoken to a child in 7 months, who had let Tobias Vane make faces at him for 3 weeks without blinking, looked down at Princess Elara of Renholt and said, "It's nothing, ma'am. Go inside, you've ink on your face." And then his knees went. He didn't fall. 2 palace men caught him before he got halfway, and he was arguing with them the whole time, saying he hadn't been dismissed the post, and the officer was shouting that he had been, and Marsh kept saying, "Sir," respectfully. And a 9-year-old girl was standing in the rain, in her stockings, screaming for someone to help him. I ran and got a chair. 63 years old, wet apron, ran into my own dining hall past 140 children who were only just beginning to understand that something had happened, and grabbed a chair and ran back out. He wouldn't sit in it. Not until the officer said, "Corporal, sit down," and then he sat, straight-backed, rifle across his knees, in a kitchen chair under the scholars' gate, with a princess holding his left hand in both of hers because she had decided that was her job now, and would not be moved on it. I went inside and I put the kettle on. I don't know why. There was nothing else I could do with my hands. When I came out with the mug, he was gray as the sky, And he looked at it and he looked at me. And he took it. First time in 7 months. They carried him to St. Maron's. It took 4 days before anybody would say he'd live. I went every day. So did Dahlin. So did the chestnut woman who brought him chestnuts he couldn't eat. So on the third day did Tobias Vane, who stood at the end of that bed in his school coat and cried like his heart was broken and could not be persuaded to say a single word, and then went home. And on the 5th day the Queen came. They cleared the ward. Of course they did. But there is no clearing a ward, not really. There's a curtain and there's a nurse's station, and there's a kitchen woman who has come with soup and who nobody has ever once looked at twice in her life. She sat down beside the bed. She hadn't brought anyone with her. She said, "Corporal Marsh." He tried to sit up. She put her hand out and stopped him. There was a long silence, long enough that I thought about leaving and couldn't make my feet do it. Then she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me as a soldier and not as a subject." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Why didn't you move?" I'd wondered that. Everyone had. Because you have to understand what he did. He stood in the path of the Queen of Renholt and told her no. Not the men. Not the knife. That came after, and any man with courage might have done that part. The other part, the standing still, the "No, ma'am, you are the Queen, and the order doesn't have an exception for you," that could have finished him. Men have been broken for less in Renholt, sent to the coast, stripped of the coat. He had no way of knowing about the boots. He hadn't seen them count the windows. That was mine, and I'd told nobody. For all Ivan Marsh knew, in that moment under the arch, he was refusing a direct instruction from his sovereign's wife on the strength of a piece of paper, in front of 40 witnesses, and ending his life. He thought about it a while. He wasn't a quick man with words. Then he said, "Ma'am, the order says the princess doesn't leave that ground without the seal. It doesn't say unless someone important asks." And she waited, because she could tell there was more. And he said, "If the order only holds when it's easy, then it isn't an order. It's a preference. And nobody dies for a preference, ma'am. But a child can die for a door that was left open because a man wanted to be liked." The Queen of Renholt put her face in her hands and wept, in a public hospital ward, in front of a corporal and a kitchen woman she never noticed. And when she was done, she said, "I would have walked her into that carriage." And Marsh said, "Yes, ma'am." He didn't soften it. He didn't say anyone would have. He didn't say you couldn't have known. He just said, "Yes, ma'am," because it was true. And then, after a moment, because he was a kind man underneath all that starch, he added, "But you didn't, ma'am. You went down on the ground and you put yourself over her. I saw it. So did 4 dozen people. That's what they'll remember." The king came back and there was an inquiry and there were arrests, and it went higher than anybody liked, and some of it has never been made public and I don't expect it ever will be. 2 men in fine houses lost everything. 1 left the country. The man with the knotted laces was hanged at Greenock in the autumn, and I did not go, and I do not care to think about it. They tried to give Marsh a medal. He accepted it because you don't refuse. Then he asked in writing whether he might return to his post. There was a fuss. They wanted to make him a sergeant, then a lieutenant, put him at the palace, walk him out at ceremonies. He said no thank you, and no thank you, and no thank you, until eventually somebody very senior got irritated and asked him what in God's name he actually wanted. And Corporal Ivan Marsh said he'd like to go back and stand under the arch at St. Aldwyn's, if that was all right, because the term wasn't finished. He came back in May. I remember because it was hay fever. He stood under that arch with his eyes streaming and his nose running and would not sniff, and 140 children walked past him and did not make faces at him, not one, not ever again. The limp never quite went. On cold mornings he stood a little wrong, weight off the left side, and he thought nobody noticed, and everybody noticed, and nobody said a word. Tobias Vane brought him a boiled sweet every Monday and put it on the wall beside him and walked away without looking back, which is how boys say things. And every mug I ever left on that wall came back washed, rinsed clean, dried, set upside down, exactly the way I do it. Elara finished the term. She finished the next one and the one after that, and she left St. Aldwyn's at 13 like all of them do, too tall for the desks, too old for my soup. She held her spoon wrong until the very last day, fist around it like a shovel. Nobody ever corrected her. I'd have had words with anyone who tried. On her last morning she came through the line and she said, "Is it the orange one today, Mrs. Crow?" And it wasn't. It was leek. But I'd made a pot of the orange one anyway, just the one pot, because I'd known this day was coming for 4 years. She cried, 13 years old, in front of everybody. Then she took her bowl outside and sat on the wall under the scholars' gate and ate it there, next to a guardsman who did not look down at her and did not speak to her and would not have moved from that arch if the sky had come down. I'm 63. I'll retire soon. My knees have opinions about the stairs. People come to the school sometimes now on account of the story. They stand on Cobb Street and look at the arch. Sometimes they ask me, because I'm the last one still there who saw it, they ask what it was like. What did bravery look like? And they always want me to say something about the knife, and the crowd, and the blood on the scarlet. But that's not what I saw. I saw a young man face the wrong way for once in his life. I saw him bring a rifle down off his shoulder and say "Your Majesty" to a woman who could have ruined him with a sentence, and then tell her no. Politely, immovably, on the strength of nothing but a piece of paper that he happened to believe in when believing in it was expensive. Everybody asks what Ivan Marsh did that day. He didn't do anything, he just wouldn't move. And I have lived a long time and washed 9,000 plates and buried a husband, and I have come to think that not moving, when moving would be so much easier and so much kinder to yourself, and nobody would ever have blamed you, is the hardest thing a person can do. 300 years of children have run their hands along that stone. It's worn smooth in the middle waist-high, where the small ones reach. Go and put your hand on it, if you're ever in Harrogate. That's the spot where he stood,